If the producer of the wine cared enough to have a lovely illustration commissioned, then the product is probably not going to be terrible. Welcome to episode 1 of the podcast. I'm sure over time we will unpack many issues and non-issues as we make art, talk about art, and ask questions of the stars. My name is Zach. I'm an artist and an art teacher. I worked with middle school and high school students for over a decade in the public school system here in the United States. So today's question: why should you make art? Right off the bat, sounds like a little bit of a silly question. But in all seriousness, what's the goal behind you making art? Humans for eons have sat down and created things of various kinds that we in the modern era have decided are art. Right off the bat, that brings up an odd question of who gets to determine whether something is art or not. I ran into this often when I was at university when we would look at all of these old pieces of work in our art history classes, particularly when we were looking at Mycenae or the Minoan portions of the Greek Empire and the Roman Empire. Not really sure that people refer to it as the Greek Empire, but anyway, we would look at these amphoras and vases, mosaics in some cases, and these objects had definite purpose in the lives of the people who created them. They were meant for carrying water, for storing rainwater. Fresh water obviously being a difficult thing to obtain when you live on an island sometimes. They were also used for wine, for fermenting other beverages, for holding things, all of the normal stuff that you would use a pot or a vessel for, even in our modern day. So these items had definitive purpose for their creators and for the people who purchased them and utilized them. And yet we refer to them now as art. We put them in museums. We talk about them as artifacts. And artifacts, I think we can much more easily say they are, indeed. But are they art? If the creator created it for a purpose and didn't think about it in an artistic sense, is it art? And secondarily, does it matter? Does it matter if we in the modern era, if me and my studio decides that something is or is not art? Maybe, maybe not. I like talking about this. It's maybe not a very productive thing to talk about, but you don't always have to be productive. But there is something about the goal of the art. These pieces were created specifically for purpose, to hold something, to brew something, to ferment something. That's their purpose, and if they achieve that and also contribute some beauty to the person who purchased them, or who created them, or who gets gifted them, then it's achieved its purpose. It is what it needs to be. Does all art need to have a goal, though? I'm going to go out on a limb just for this podcast and say that yes, it does, indeed. Always, 100% of the time, it needs a goal. Your art must have a purpose. Now, those purposes can be widely divergent, and they can be different for each person. Historically, one of the most important purposes of art was to record events, to be able to describe to people in the future or to even just your children, this is what happened. Here is an image of this public figure being sworn into office. Here's a picture of Jesus coming down from the clouds. Here's a sculpture depicting the mother of Jesus holding him after he was crucified and pulled down from the cross. Historically, art had a predefined purpose of communicating a particular thing. So that's something that's been around since the dawn of time. It's also something we use nowadays, and often we use it in a more humorous fashion as a commentary on things. For ages, we've seen political cartoons, comics in the newspaper, things that are just commenting on what's happening in the world around us. If you cruise through Instagram or on Google Images today, you'll still run into all kinds of these things. And though some people might be hesitant to look at these as art, I would venture to say that memes and the whole meme culture, even starting back when I was in high school with demotivational posters and things like that, all of that is just a new social commentary form of art. These are something we use with our friends and our family to communicate something that is much more difficult to communicate through text. Sometimes an image, a scene from a movie, a video game, or even just a well-timed emoji can be perfect at communicating what it needs to. Sometimes this is commentary on a particular thing, sometimes it's just humorous, sometimes it's an inside joke, but this communication is a core part of art. And so maybe that's all the goal is for memes, and that's fine. Sometimes art has a specific purpose of telling a story. This happens in movies, in games, in film, all of the time. You see a tiny little snippet of this on the cover of a book, where the cover often implies what's going to happen inside the book. Though, if you're anything like me, you've often picked up a book in the library, if people still go to libraries, or bookstore and been fascinated with the cover. Just, this must be an amazing book. Look at this illustration. And you look up a review of it, or you read the book, or you read the back of the book, and you're just so disappointed. That illustration held so much hope and so much promise. I always feel betrayed when I open a book and discover that the cover was much higher quality than the content. Or maybe it's not that it's higher quality, but it's just they didn't seem to align with one another. I tend to look at a product and assume that the quality of the illustration, the quality of the logo work, the graphic design work must innately tie in to the quality of the product. I do this when I buy bottles of wine. I spent years trying to research, trying to understand what the different grapes were, what the different providers were, what the different regions were, the difference between buying wine from the US versus from abroad, and it was just overwhelming. At a certain point, this also extends in a really weird way to if I go into the store and I'm trying to find a particular product like SpaghettiOs or something that is just a nostalgia bomb for me, and the label has changed, I will in fury leave the store and not buy the product. Because my innate artistic assumption is, you change the label, there's no way you didn't change something else about the product. Is it rational? No. Am I going to change? Probably not. Art can also be used to tell stories. And this is probably the most exciting part of art for me. This is the most exciting potential goal that you could have for your art when you set out to create something. Now, I already mentioned this when it comes to games and films and movies and all those kind of things. But for me, the personal angle of this is what hooked me on art in the first place. When I was a little kid, cameras were not very prolific. We didn't have them built into our phones. Some people owned real cameras that used old school film. The vast majority of the time that I had access to a camera, it was one of those old little Kodaks that would take 24 or 36 pictures, and then you'd have to take it to a Walmart or Walmart equivalent and get the film developed. It was very bad. The images were terrible. But my father, who flew reconnaissance for the military, would travel abroad to places like Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, and Thailand. And he wasn't particularly capable of coming back with photographs and showing them to me. So what he would do is he would take his sketchbook out and he would draw pieces of the jungle. He would draw animals that he ran into, which is humorous to me now because my dad doesn't really like the creepy crawlies. He would talk about how much the foot-long grasshoppers that he ran into in basic training, reconnaissance training in South America just creeped him out. But he would illustrate these things. He would sketch what the plants look like. He would sketch what the buildings look like sometimes, but predominantly plants and animals. And he would bring those drawings home to me. My tiny 5 or 6 year old self would be excited to see my father returning from several months abroad, but I would receive along with the stories these images. And he did this really cool thing too, where he would often insert me, a little illustration of me, into these drawings. So there'd be this little blonde-haired boy in the jungle of Cambodia. And I would be interacting with these critters and these lizards and these snakes and things like that. And it felt like I was being transported to that. So the story my father was able to tell with those images instilled in me the sense that art can take you somewhere where you can't normally go. And at that point, it started with something as simple as being transported to a jungle halfway across the world, which obviously isn't a small feat, but eventually that turned into being transported to science fiction worlds and to fantasy worlds, and that the art and the stories did that. They took me to those places. Another really cool thing that my father did along the same train of thought, instead of reading books to me as a child, he would sit down and just tell stories. I'd have no idea how he kept track of all the characters and everything that would happen. I think it was partly linked to he would sit down and he would ask me to do a recap of the prior night, and that would probably remind him. But he would sit down and just tell stories about halflings and dwarves and elves and dragons, and he just made up these stories over months and months and months. I'd like to assume that he was thinking about these things while he was working and coming up with what the story was that he was going to tell that evening. I don't know. I'm going to ask him now after putting this podcast together because I'm really curious. But all of those stories and that art taught me that that's one of the most valuable things that art can do, and one of the most valuable things we can do for other people. So one of the most powerful goals of art is the telling of stories, the telling of your stories. And I think, very importantly, the telling of stories that no one else has told yet. I met a friend in my 8th grade year that also started to open more of these doors and windows in my mind. His name was Dan, and he came to our school, this little private school, and he was just a breath of fresh air. That's a weird way to say it. It was more that he was just very different than everything else that was around him. But he came in and he drew fantastically. And it didn't take long for everyone to be aware of that. The part that I was really intrigued by, though, was that his drawings had a consistency to them. When I started talking to him about them, he excitedly opened these journals and sketchbooks and talked about his worlds and the races and the planets and the trips between the planets, and this massive lore just began to unfold. He was telling stories through the design of his characters, the design of their ships, the design of the animals, the design of the monsters. It was a mind-altering thing to see. I had always played games like Warcraft and Total Annihilation, but to see these things unfolding from one of my fellows, it was encouraging. And it told me I could do the same. I could start building my own planets, my own worlds, my own fantasy ideas inside my mind. The goal shifted, and my goal became to tell stories. Now, telling stories isn't the only goal you can have in the creation of your art. Sometimes people create art to impress others. When we're young, we do this often to impress our elders, our teachers, our older siblings, even our parents. We love having things thrown up on the wall or thrown up on the fridge. We need that love and that adoration. And as we mature and we produce art into our adulthood, I don't know that that desire really goes away. I think it just shifts. There's a weird, twisted version of that plays out on Instagram right now as people chase likes and they try to post things that will get them more likes and more attention. I know that this is just a normal human thing, but if this is you, if you fall into this trap, just be careful that you don't tie your sense of self-worth in with how many likes you get or how many followers you have. I don't think there's anything wrong with chasing some of that affection, but it's dangerous to base your self-worth and your sense of personal value on the response you get from the anonymous faces on the internet. But what if the goal for you is a little bit more elusive? What if you don't even really like creating art, but you feel like you have to? You slowly go crazy if you wake up in the morning and realize that you didn't make anything yesterday. What if it's like having low blood sugar, where there's just something wrong, and it takes you a while to realize why you're so grumpy and agitated, and oh, it's because I didn't eat lunch for the last 6 days. Maybe creating art is like that to you, where if you don't do it, something inside your brain is just not working correctly. It's like the loosening of the screws that hold your consciousness together. And as long as you don't create something just keeps being unsettled and rattling around in the back seat of your brain. This is certainly me to an extent. If I don't create things, if I'm not productive in some artistic sense, then I slowly start to go insane. Not literally insane, hopefully, but I do start to become a little unhinged. There's some piece of my daily joy and happiness that seems to be tied in with creating. And it doesn't need to be limited to art. Sometimes it can just be the conjuring of ideas. It can be writing. Sometimes journaling will even take care of it for me. Often music or writing songs has taken care of it, but I have to do something. And so the goal there is a little bit more convoluted. The goal is more to maintain an equilibrium, to be content, to have some level of joy, and art allows me to do that. Let's take a look at the other side of things, though, for just a moment. What if you don't have a goal? I know I said earlier on that all art must have a goal. What if you are the punk rocker and you buck that system? You go, nope, I'm not going to have a goal. I'm just here for the art of making a thing. I'm just here for the joy of putting my pencil on paper. Well, I could argue that that is a goal in and of itself, that there's a goal there. But let's assume that you're just making art because of the tangibility of it. You like how a pencil feels on paper. You're not even drawing anything in particular. You're making lines. Maybe you're just shading a whole page. Every once in a while, I would run into students who would just take a piece of graph paper and they would just color in every other square on the entire piece of graph paper. I wouldn't necessarily call that art, but I think there is a therapy in the monotony of little teeny activities like that. So maybe that's the reason why you ought to make art, why you need to make art. Maybe your friends do it. Maybe it's just something that the people that you spend time with do, and so you're like, well, I want to blend in, I want to belong to this group, so I'm going to do it. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. You don't always have to have a definitive purpose for why you're sitting down and making a thing. I think it's always better for your psyche to sit down and create something. Sometimes it can just be play. And is there a goal to playing? As an adult, when I look at my daughter and see her playing with marbles or playing in the dirt or throwing sand at a cat, well, actually, if she was throwing sand at a cat, I would tell her to stop because it's not particularly kind. But the point persists. When I look at my daughter and she's out playing in a way that doesn't necessarily tie into any particular skill, I have no problem with that as a father. I understand that part of her need is to play, is to learn how the laws of physics function, to learn how she fits into the world around her, and also just to exist and find joy. Maybe that is a purpose, maybe that is a goal, but it's more ethereal. It's not particularly and definitively designed. And why should you create art? Maybe one of these goals is going to be right on the tent peg for you and exactly what you need, and maybe not. But if you are listening to this, there's a good chance that you have some innate need to create. Maybe you have the need to impress those around you. Maybe you just have a desire to create things. Maybe it's relaxing and therapeutic for you to sit down and draw or paint or even work on one of those adult coloring books. If this is you, I encourage you to keep going, to keep creating, to try some new things. And if this is not you, if you don't feel like you have much in the way of artistic tendencies, I want to encourage you to try. I want to encourage you to pick something up. Pick up a sketchbook. If you don't have a sketchbook, pick up a piece of printer paper. If you don't have a piece of printer paper, just grab an old box from your donuts that you bought this last weekend or for your frozen pizza and crack it open and get a pen or a pencil and just try putting something down. If you have no ideas of what to draw, just start with your own name and make it fancy and play with it. I think that you will find that the creating is necessary to being fully human. When I was at university, especially taking the childhood psychology classes that came as part of the art education program, we talked about something that they referred to as the creator instinct. In a religious sense, this makes a lot of sense. If we were created by some divine being, then we have a desire to create as well. But even though this was an agnostic program, it still used that connotation, that creator instinct was something that was referred to, that we as humans have a need to create. I think some of this extends from the need to propagate oneself, to have children, but there's also something that just seems to be innate in us as humans, that we must create, we must leave some legacy, something. And so if you feel like you are not particularly artistically inclined, I would encourage you to try some new things. Try putting marks on paper. Try putting paint on a canvas. Don't put too much pressure on yourself. Pressure can be the destroyer. And maybe, just maybe, don't give yourself a particularly defined goal at the beginning. Just try to make things. Sometimes the goals can distract us from the actual creation of what we need to create, what we need to make. So if this is you who needs to just get into it, try. Just try. Work on that donut box. You can do it. Be the donut box kid. Have a good one, y'all. See you soon.